Those tests can often uncover a condition or a risk for a condition that's important to discuss with your healthcare provider so that you can put together a plan for how that situation can be addressed. Tests that are regulated by the federal government may be more likely to give you accurate results. You can figure this out by looking at the packaging on the at-home medical test, and you can also go to the FDA website where there's a searchable database of at-home medical tests.